amazing thing that it counts as work. I still can't believe that what I do for a living counts as work. I can't believe that story counted as work. So I don't have any prepared remarks. So I thought we'd just sort of throw this open. If you have any questions about what it's like to do this for a living, it's very satisfying. But I started off doing exactly what you're doing. I worked on my high school newspaper, my college newspaper, and the enjoyment that I got out of it persuaded me that I was pre-med at the time at Berkeley, and I said, no, let's try this instead. So I've had about 40 years of this stick. Yeah.
Are you assigned most of your articles, or do you find that you have to go out and actually look for actual stories to cover?
Most of the stuff that you do when you're on staff is assigned. Every once in a while you'll get an idea and go with it. Some of the ones I brought, well, we're not going to talk about it. But yeah, I would say most of the stuff you do when you're on staff is assigned. And that means you sort of have to get up for a story that you may not have had a natural inclination to go cover on your own. And that's part of the job, to manufacture, it's not faking it, but it's manufacturing an enthusiasm for something that you didn't know you were going to be enthusiastic about. Yeah.
As you said, you worked for the newspaper in that time, and that's considered like one of the kind of golden ages for newspapers.
Yeah,
and
well,
now
every age is a golden age.
Yeah.
This is the golden age for somebody, probably you guys.
But as we're starting to move away from print and more online,
We've moved away from it. Yeah.
what do you feel is the future for journalism? And
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I carry these things around in my pocket too, and these things are responsible. They transformed everything. Nobody, well, raise your hand if you read a print paper today. And this is a newspaper class. Now, when I was at Gad would have gone up in journalism class. And that's good. I mean, most of the people, I mean, these things have transformed everything, and they use a lot of things well. They give you instantaneous access to a lot of stuff. But they give you have to ask the next question, which is instantaneous access to what? And that's a question that is still we're still trying to answer. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, as I was telling the other class, these things are very good at a lot of things. You can, a plane crashes, you've got 10,000 people going like that, taking a picture, and they're good at tweets, and yeah, but you have to ask yourself, what are you getting in exchange for the great numbers of professional newspaper reporters and journalists that are no longer on staff? Chronicle used to have 400 to 500, now it's fewer than 100. And the number of reporters that are assigned to San Francisco City Hall for the San Francisco Chronicle went from 10 to 1. And the sets of eyes that are watching the various departments of government and the functions of government to make sure nobody's ripping you off, that's dwindled, and seriously dwindled. And we're in the middle of a great revolution of journalism, but I just hope that the great functions that are being performed continue to be performed. Right now, they aren't. And yeah, I miss holding a newspaper in my hand. I'm old-fashioned that way. But I can see that it's going to go away, not going to come back. And I know that the Egyptians probably like their papyrus and their clay tablets, and those aren't around anymore either. I'm not a sentimentalist about it. I just think that the function is more important, and the function is not being performed now because the economic changes that journalism is going through right now have not allowed large independent news gathering staffs to continue to be employed. And that troubles me a lot more than the absence of a print product. Yes?
What articles or what types of articles did you start writing in 1976?
Well, when you start out, you do anything the editor tells you anyway. But traditionally, as a new reporter, you're covering police stories and hard news, basic stories and obituaries and all sorts of nuts and bolts things that later on you do less and less. I always thought that some of the most satisfying things to do were the very basic things done well, an obituary or a crime story. And everybody would say, well, that must be a difficult interview, an obituary, to call up a grieving widow and ask her about her husband. It turns out to be one of the easier. You always want to tell me about it. So you can't shut them up. Anyway, you do anything, you do more basic things at the beginning, and then I worked out to get some sort of a specialty. I wound up being kind of a feature writer, and they had me doing a column for 13 years at the paper 4 days a week, which was like doing a final exam every other day. You know, so you finished one, and it was time to, you have a big hole the next day to still fill it up. Yeah.
What have been some of your most life-changing stories that you've worked on?
Life-changing. Well, you know, a reporter always should have good answers for those kinds of questions. And the thing about being a newspaper reporter is your attention span is so focused that you can rarely remember what you did yesterday. I should have an answer for that. Often the paper will come out and somebody will say, I liked your story today, or they didn't like your story today. You have no idea what they're talking about because you wrote the story yesterday. And it's sort of, your question is in that way. I mean, one of the things that I still can't believe that they paid me to do was to ride my bicycle across the country. I was going to do that I did that a few years ago. I set it up originally as a leave of absence, but it's something I always wanted to do. And the editor said, well, why don't you write some stories about it? Why are you doing it? And I said, okay, you're going to pay me to do it? And they left me on salary for the whole 2 weeks, which was the best scam I ever pulled in the news. And that was life-changing for me. Everybody else on this ride, there was a group of 40, it was a fundraiser. And they were all very ticked off because none of them were getting paid salary to go on. Oh, don't bother Steve, he's going to work today. Don't bother Steve, he's going to work today. Anyway, I should be able to think of some answers. I've seen some pretty awful things firsthand, some pretty wonderful things firsthand. I've been assigned to some of the great events of our day, covered some great things that I should be able to remember. I can't. Yeah.
How many articles have you written?
Probably byline things. I really don't know. Maybe one or two. Maybe an average of. Well, not everything byline, but certainly 1 or 2 stories a day for 35 years. So that's how many working days? 300 working days a year.
Like
300 times 30, 10,000. Maybe.
His Google Drive must be full.
Yeah, like compiling a memoir.
Say again?
A memoir.
Nobody reads books anymore. Nobody reads newspapers. Every time somebody would ask me, did I want to do a collection of my own columns, I would always say, I'm more interested in the column that I'm going to write next week and then the ones I wrote last year. It'd be collections of stuff never sell, and memoirs. I looked at some of my colleagues who wrote memoirs, specifically Art Hoppe, who was a hero of mine. A name you may not be familiar with, but he's one of the great practitioners of this method. And he wrote the best newspaper memoir I ever read. Buy it for a penny on Amazon. It didn't do any business. That's not the reason to write a book or not to write a book. It's just I was always concerned with the next thing rather than the next. Yes.
We had a journalist last year here who said that it wasn't so much about writing as it was his experiences with people. Which has it been more?
Well, that's true. I mean, it's both, of course. You ask, the best question that you can ask when you're with somebody is, then what happened? That's a great question. You want to stay out of it. You want to let the person that you're interviewing, whoever you're talking to, you want them to talk. You don't want to ask a yes or no question. You want to focus on the person that you're interviewing. And yes, of course, the experience of meeting and seeing everything firsthand is a wonderful experience. But the satisfaction of telling a story well, and when you've written something well, it does the job, and when you've done something that just sort of gets by. But the feeling that you get when you've written something that you feel represents the event or the person, that's a good feeling. So I like them both, yeah. Yes?
When you were doing some of the more breaking news reporting, and especially as we're going online now, how did you weigh the need to get it out quickly versus get it out correctly?
Correctly always wins.
Right, but I mean, especially now as we're going online, like how does that change?
Well, some of the great mistakes have been made by people going too fast, sloppy, careless. The people that lost their job for the Korean Airlines prank. The Asiana Airlines prank. They could tell you, answer that question very well. That was done in speed and haste and stupidity and without checking because they wanted to beat whoever they thought they were going to beat. And it cost a lot of people their job, including in front of them. You know, everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? Yeah? The ASEAN, the phony name for the pilot and the crew. So, yeah, you have to get it right before you get it done quickly. And, yeah, of course, and before all the wonderful ways of telling the story and the stylistic touches and the great turns of phrase, your accuracy and your getting the information correct has to come first. But it's a good question. They go hand in hand, of course. You know, a story about, you know, a perfectly written story about the ASEAN plane crash now would be worthless. I mean, a news story. Yes?
So gradually over time, do you, as a writer, become more specific into like one particular type of article, or is it always like throughout your time as staff you were assigned whatever the editor?
Well, some reporters at a newspaper are general assignment, and they stay general assignment all their career. Some very quickly established beats are specialists within their beat. And Nanette, who you would have had here instead of me, is her beat is education. In other words, she's responsible for covering everything education related and generating her own stories and telling the editor that such and such is going on at the University of California today in the Regents meeting and such and such. And she sort of tells the editor what she's going to be covering. When you do a beat, that's the way that works. When you're general assignment, you sort of more or less wait for an assignment to come from the desk. And I always found that to be a little bit more interesting. I never really wanted a specific beat. I suppose I did specialize in feature stories and human interest stuff and off-the-wall things. I can't imagine Nanette being sent to cover that story on me. I'm pointing it up because I thought it was projected, but I guess you guys got it. The thing about the urinal. But, so I thought that was, to me, more, she wouldn't have been assigned to cover that. I was more in my off-the-wall feature beat, but I guess it wasn't my beat. But they sort of figure out what you're interested in, and they figure out what you're good at. And for instance, I would never be assigned to, if the president came to town, I wouldn't be assigned to be the reporter that covered the president. And that's fine with me. I don't want to cover the president. I can't imagine asking the president a question that I would, you know, I remember during the Clinton presidency, when Clinton came to town, I didn't talk to him. Clinton's chef came to town, the White House chef. I did talk to him, and I got a big story out of him, and that was a better story than the person who interviewed the president. Always, in my judgment, always, if you have a choice between the president and the president's chef, always take the chef. Yeah.
Have there any conflicts with what you've written?
Conflicts? Well, folks are always a little bit sore at what you write. They're never entirely happy in the same way that when you have a photograph of yourself, you never really quite like it, right? I mean, it's you, and the photograph didn't really lie, but it's not the way you would have wished yourself to be presented. And people that read a story that you've written about them sort of have the same take on it often. You always have to remember that your first obligation is not to satisfy the person that you've interviewed, or not to satisfy the editor, or the publisher, or the advertiser. Your first obligation is to the poor person that picks up the newspaper or reads you online, the reader. This person that you will never meet, unlike the editor, unlike the subject of the story. You never meet the reader. He's just the most important person in the whole thing. It's this sacrosanct relationship that you have with this anonymous person that you'll never meet, that you don't want to meet, that you don't want to have anything to do with you. To do it, when a reader calls you and wants to talk to you about the story you wrote, you don't want to talk to him. You did everything you could in the whole world for that person. But geez, the last thing you want to do is have a conversation with him. You know. So your obligation is not to please the person who you wrote about, who is never going to really be pleased. Your obligation is to the reader and to yourself that you gave that person, that you gave the world a fair shake that day, that you accurately portrayed whatever you were writing about, whether it's the president or a urinal, whether you told the story as best you could. Yes?
How long does it take on average to come out with an article for you?
Well, an hour can be forever. If you know what you want to say, you've seen the experience, you've been with the urinal guy, you've tested the urinal, right? An hour is plenty of time to write it up. You don't need a lot of time. I would rather have an hour to write that story up, having had the experience, having done the interview, having had my notes, having gone through my notebook and circled all the quotes I'm going to use maybe. An hour is plenty of time. I would rather have that hour and have the experience done than have a week to do the story, but not having done the reporting. And some of the great stories, the stories that I use when I'm teaching journalism classes that have lived for a century were written in an hour. That have lived that long.
And how long did an average interview take for you?
Good question. The answer is, as in Alice in Wonderland, begin at the beginning, go to the end, and then stop. There isn't a good answer to that. You have a sense when you have enough, and when you're asking cumulative questions, the things that you're repeating yourself, or when you've had enough, or when the person is sick of you. And often, sometimes a question will occur to you afterwards, and then you call the person back. You really drop the ball. But the longer that you do this, the more that doesn't happen. The more you get a sense that you have hit everything you want to hit. At the beginning, sometimes reporters will make a list of questions and make sure. But the one thing you don't really want to do is be tied to a list of prepared questions. I mean, it's okay to generally jot down a couple of notes, make sure you ask about this. But you don't want to be so locked into a set of questions that you don't allow an interview to go off into a tangent that turns out to be productive. And you want to shut up as much as possible during the interview. You just want to say, I've heard some of the greatest interviews. The guy I used to sit next to, Kevin Wallace, in the 1970s. He'd be on the phone. I'll be done. And he'd be scribbling. Then what happened? And that would be his. It wouldn't be all that, of course, but he would let, in his way, he would let the person tell the story with as little input from him as possible. That's a great question. Yes, if the interview is going in a productive area, sometimes it needs to be steered into a productive area. Yeah.
What's the hardest part of an interview?
Well, if you have something tricky that you have to ask, something that is not a question that that person wants to answer first, you probably hold off on that till the end. And you have to figure out a way of asking an answered question. All these people are saying you murdered your wife. Did you really? You don't say, why did you murder your wife? I mean, that's a stupid example. But, you have to figure out a way of phrasing something so that you're coming off as sort of sympathetic, but you're still getting the question answered. Difficult subject, written answer. If, for instance, the interview with Liam Neeson on 60 Minutes, where they talked about the death of his wife, the actress, for the Brady. I don't know if you saw it. Did anybody watch 60 Minutes? Okay, so they held off on that to the end, but he knew the question was coming. It was a difficult thing for him to talk about, but he knew it was coming, and they asked it, and he answered it. It was good. But they didn't start off with it. Yeah.
When you have an interview like that where you have to ask a really difficult question and they aren't answering, so not something like the Liam Neeson example, but something where you're trying to get information out of them that they don't want to give you. How do you go about that, and how do you try to get it?
Well, there's a little device. Sometimes you use, someone so told me, or I read somewhere else, and you say something that, and I want to get your side of it. Sometimes you say it like that. So that's a hack way of doing it. Sometimes, it's accurate. Oh boy, I don't really know. Surprisingly, a lot of the times that people you don't think want to talk about something negative, they do. I was fascinated in that at the end of the Olympics coverage when they brought up the two figure skaters involved, Tonya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan. You couldn't shut up either of them about that thing. And there was a documentary about it. I thought the last thing that Nancy Kerrigan wanted to do was talk about how this incident 20 years ago that defined her as a victim rather than as a skater. But you couldn't shut her up about it. And sometimes people will want to talk about things that you don't think they want to talk about. How do you ask tough questions? You ask it with sympathy. You ask it forthrightly. Sometimes you soften it with the phrasing of the question, but you always try and ask it. And you always try and get a question answered. You're there on behalf of the reader. You're not there to do a favor to the interview center. Yes?
How has your day changed now that you're a freelance writer rather than?
Well, that's a good question. I left the paper a few years ago from full-time staff, and I'm a freelancer, and I'm also teaching now, and I'm enjoying that. And I left for a variety of reasons, a lot of them tied to the economic changes and the changes in journalism that we talked about, and the fact that they were offering huge buyouts to reporters to do what I did, not to send kids through college. I figured I better jump at it because it was no guarantee that newspapers would still be around. That said, how's it changed? It's changed. The main change that I see is that the economics of this business are no longer a sure thing. And the size, the numbers of people that are making a living wage to support their families in this is drastically low. Yes, there are blogs. Yes, there are outlets. Yes, there are people tweeting. Yes, there's unlimited sources of information. You can't get these things to shut up. But the people that are making a living at this, that seems to have dwindled. And yes, there are jobs for the people who aren't the best in everything, and there will continue always to be that. But the total number of paid journalism jobs right now is not what it used to be. And I hope that comes back up, and I hope that an economic model is found to employ all of you if this is what you choose to do. It's not by no means clear that that's going to be the case. Yes.
Are there specific forms of journalism you see that are tending to be more successful in terms of just paid jobs?
Well, the same. I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. I just sort of did my end of it. And the business element of journalism, I always tried to stay out of. I never wanted to talk to the advertising department or the advertisers. Never wanted to find out what the most lucrative part of the job was. I was just trying to be my end of it. Let the rest of it serve itself. Yes?
You noticed that in response to the economic situation, the style of the article changing in the city?
Well, what change I've noticed is it's thin, it's smaller, and the stories are short. And yes, there's more room on the online version for all the stuff that doesn't run. I mean, I've noticed that some of the stories I've written, it'll be cut in the newspaper and run in greater, in the original length on the online version. So, because space is obviously not a premium. Length is the main thing that I've noticed. Not the same number of stories and not the same length of stories. And I still subscribe, and I still hold the paper in my hand every morning. And in addition to getting it on my computer and my cell phone, I still rely on the print version, which I know fewer and fewer people do. It's just because it's a habit that I acquired when I was your age, and one which is hard to break for me. I still like holding a print copy of the paper in my hand and flipping through it. I find it very, in the vernacular, user-friendly in a way that I don't find these things. But just because I didn't grow up with these things. I grew up with holding it in my hand. Yeah.
As more of a features type writer,
Yeah.
do you find that as news becomes more fast-paced and more focused on speed of how you get it out, do you feel that something like the Urinal article would still have room to be published?
I like to think so. I like to think that there's always room, and one of the great things about newspaper or any kind of news coverage, there always seems to be room for everything. There's room for the important stuff. There's room for the tragedies of the day, and the politics, and the upheaval in Ukraine, and the Iran, the nuclear situation in the Middle East, and there's room for sculptors, unusual sculptors who make their unusual sculptures. I hope that doesn't change, and it's one of the great things about a newspaper. There's something in there for everybody. Some people just turn right to the crossword puzzle or sports, and at different ages in your life, you turn to different sections first. You know, I remember as a kid, my dad always People would come in, you'd slip the sports section under the door to me, and that's what I wanted to read first. And now I look at it sometimes very rarely. Not so important. Yes?
What was the workplace environment like for you? Was it very fast-paced?
Yes. It's very exciting to be in a newspaper newsroom. You're in one huge, large room. Everybody is a colleague. Most of the people are friends with one another. There's a couple of people butting heads, but not usually. It's the kind of room where you're sitting there and you don't know how to spell Mississippi. You can yell, "Hey, how do you spell Mississippi?" And somebody on the other side of the room will yell back at you the answer. It's very collegial, very friendly, very fast-paced. And closer you get to deadline, the more people will get a little bit squirrely and stuff. A lot of talking. A lot of editors telling you to shut up, like this wonderful person did when you're trying to get important stuff done, like make a list like that. And I miss it. I do miss it every day. It's an exciting way to spend the day. And the most exciting thing is you have no idea when you walk in the morning, very rarely when you're general assignment, what the hell you're going to be doing. You really don't. And some people find that unnerving. Some people, if you're a shoe salesman, a week from next Tuesday you're going to be selling shoes. And 3 months from next Friday you're going to be selling shoes. But when you're a newspaper in this racket, you really have no idea what you're going to be doing. Some people find that unsettling, but I found it invigorating. Yes?
How did you decide to become a writer, and what would you say to someone who wants to pursue journalism today?
I would say to continue to pursue it. If it's something that's in your blood, you'll find out. If it's something you're good at, the way you're going to find out about it is by being in a class like this and being in a college paper. And finding out not only if your stuff is running, but whether or not it satisfies you as a way of doing it. Yes, there will be jobs. Fewer, but always jobs for people who are good at their work and who are passionate about it. So I would say yes, continue to do it, especially if you are enjoying doing it.
So is that why you decided to?
It is. I mean, I was, at UC Berkeley, I was pre-med, and then, but I was enjoying my work on the college paper, which I was doing as sort of a hobby. And then I made one of those 180-degree turns that college is for figuring things out. And I said, why don't you try doing this? You're having a better time doing this, aren't you? And I answered my own question that I would. And so I just kept at it. Yes?
Did you ever consider writing for a paper other than the Chronicle?
I always liked the Chronicle. I was lucky to get on staff at an early age. I always wanted to write a column, and I thought, well, if the Chronicle wasn't going to let me do that, maybe I'd look around. But right about the time I felt that, they said, why don't you try writing a column? I did that for me. And that was, something I always wanted to do. And I did that for about 13 years, and I went back to working before. And I had a wonderful run there as a full-time reporter. And I'm enjoying my freelancing, and I still, nothing like writing a story, whether you're there as a staff member or as a freelancer. The important thing is whether or not the story you just wrote reflects the subject and is the best work that you can do. And that doesn't have anything to do with the economics or in what mechanism you got paid. It has to do with whether the story did the job.
Are you still writing an article a day, or is it?
No, not anymore. I'm more like once or twice a month, and but I'm teaching journalism now at San Francisco State, and also substitute as an elementary school teacher in San Francisco. And some days on the same day. Last week I taught kindergarten and college on the same day. Yes.
How personally do you take writing, and do you have kind of creative outlet outside of journalism?
Well, the wonderful thing about journalism is that it is its own outlet. I mean, it does allow you to express, it gives you an outlet that other jobs don't. And I don't care how limiting you think that this format of the inverted pyramid, who, what, where, when, why is, it's not limiting at all. It is expanding. It just focuses your thoughts in a way that, yes, it's a great outlet. I don't know whether the one example of my writing that you have experienced gives you a feel for that. But to tell a story in your own way, to take a complicated situation and filter it through your eyes and your experience and distill it in the way that you would distill it. And it's very satisfying. It's its own release. You don't, I mean, I'm not trivializing, but it's its own, you don't need a shrink. You've got this outlet, you know. I mean, this thing about the thing about the bicycle, you know, it allowed me to take something that was very important to me, that 2-month bike trip, and tell a story about crossing the country and get paid for it, and to distill a very individual and complicated, complex thing, and to sort of take people along with the ride. That was a very satisfying thing to do. That's what I looked like when I knew what I was doing riding a bike across. That was the last day. I also was about 20 pounds skinnier. Riding a bike for 2 months to do that. Okay, so more questions? Yes?
Do you ever have writer's block? Do you ever feel like you don't have the words to express a story?
Sometimes, and usually it comes to not having asked yourself the right questions. For me, when I get in a situation like that, it's what's going on? Go back to the beginning. What happened? What's the essence of this thing? If you ask yourself the right questions and you answer them the right way, the writer's block takes care of itself. Sometimes a stroll around the block or a stroll in the coffee machine helps. But it's usually a matter of re-asking the question or simplifying it, or you wrote a long sentence that you should break up into 3 things, or you should begin at the beginning, as Alice in Wonderland says, and go to the end. Present it logically. Sometimes asking a friend or a trusted colleague or bouncing it off of them will help you get over it. I find once you get over that initial thing, once you've written the first sentence and you're on your way, the rest of it often takes care of itself. I see some nods from most of you. Yes?
Do you have any inspirations that influence how you write?
Well, some of the great writers, I'm sure that I share my admiration for some of the great people who have done this for a living. I mean, Hemingway and Twain both started off as newspaper reporters. Mark Twain wrote for the San Francisco Chronicle for 2 weeks until he realized he wasn't getting paid very much. A very common reaction in those days or in these days. I get inspired by, I get inspired by coming to this class. And I get inspired by seeing young people who wanted to do this. That's inspiring. I get inspired by reading something that I admire and saying, I wish I'd done that. Gee, maybe I could do something that good next time I do. You never have written a perfect story. And after you've written something and you read it a week later, you're your own worst critic. You always see something that you could have done better. At least I do. I'm sure you know that feeling. I wish you had that story to do over again because you would have put something else in and you would have taken something else out. I've seen some odd, yeah.
Did you ever feel burned out sometimes, especially when you're kind of overloaded with articles?
I know the feeling. I know the burned out feeling. There are some reporters that say burnout is an occupational hazard. I always felt that when I was getting frustrated and it was something in me that I wasn't bringing my A game to the job that day. Because the job, the potential is limitless. The job, there's nothing wrong with the job. If you were frustrated on that day, it's because you didn't bring something to this most wonderful job of all that you should have brought that day. In the case of reporters that have gotten burnout, maybe you didn't bring it that year or the last 5 years. But there's certainly nothing wrong with the job. The job is the greatest creative outlet and the greatest first-hand look at history, first-hand look at the human experience that you can possibly get. I always felt that way. I still feel that way. Yes?
Have your articles ever taken you somewhere outside the country or to a place you probably didn't have?
Well, I've done some travel stories outside the country. The Chronicle typically would send other places in the country, not usually outside the country, when they had the dough to send people at all. Nowadays, they don't have the dough to send anybody. They didn't send, as I mentioned, they didn't send anybody to do the Olympics in Russia, and they should have. The travel budget is way, way down. But yes, the paper did send me a lot of places around the country during the days when they had the dough to do it. Am I running short of time?
Well, this is a 90-minute period, and you're scheduled for about half of it, which is now.
Now, okay.
You're not scheduled for another class.
Okay. Do I have one or two more
yeah,
questions? Or?
But yeah, so there's no hurry, but yeah, at some point I want to sense the
Yeah, you have stories to write, I'm sure. Yes.
Has your writing ever gone to like other mediums, past journalism, like poetry, or?
Yeah, like poetry stinks. I tried writing a novel, that I didn't like that either. Yeah, I've tried times and time. You dance with what brung you, and this is what brung you, you know. I sort of have stuck with those. I admire those other forms, but don't have particular skills. Yes?
Did you ever have aspirations to go to like a larger newspaper where they had budget to send you like around the world? Like, did you ever want to do that? Or
No, I didn't want to be a foreign correspondent, if that's what you're asking. I didn't want to work for the New York Times. I liked the Chronicle. I liked being in the Bay Area. Of course, I had a family, and at that point, there are those considerations too. You don't want to move everybody for someplace else. But I liked what I was doing, and I liked where I was doing it. And the one thing that I did want to do, which was to try writing a column, the Chronicle did let me do. At the time in my career that I wanted to try to do it. Okay, I'm really gratified that you guys have asked me to come here today. I know I'm not who you expected, and I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be able to tell you a little bit about this job that we all seem to love together. I know you wouldn't be in this class if you didn't want to do this and wanted to find out if it's right for you. And all I want to impart to you is that it was right for me, and I enjoyed doing it ever since I think I first walked into the newspaper at the University of California, Berkeley in 1969 or 1970, which may have been before some of you were born. And I still find it exciting to walk into a newspaper for the same reason that you do. It is an exciting way to spend the day. It's an exciting way to spend a year or a career. It is a very satisfying thing to do. It's a creative outlet. If there's a satisfaction in sharing what you do with the world at large, but mainly it satisfies you. It's not a bad way to make a buck. Thank you.